Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for BRYCS Peer Exchange on Refugee 101 with a special look at child-specific issues and for your interest in this important topic. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you need help troubleshooting during this presentation, please use the chat box or email info@brycs.org. This webinar will be recorded and archived, and an evaluation will be sent after the webinar is completed. A copy of the slides and any supplemental material can be found in the shared files box in the bottom left of your screen. As a courtesy, all phone lines have been muted. And when we get to the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, please use the chat box to submit your questions, and any unanswered questions will be posted and responded to on BRYCS blog. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today. We have Margaret McDonald, Darwency Clark, and Isabella Suero-Stackel. Margaret McDonald has worked on refugee, immigrant, and trafficked children's issues for 15 years. She has run a national outreach and education program on child trafficking, conducted program planning and evaluation for services to refugee and trafficked children, and provides training and technical assistance on services to these youth. She has also worked with specialized refugee foster care programs and written on patterns and trends in the resettlement of unaccompanied refugee children into the U.S., as well as conducted research on the issue of child trafficking. She's earned her master's degree in social work from the Catholic University of America. Isabella Suero-Stackel works as our Program Support Coordinator for the Trafficking Victims Assistant Program here at USCCB MRS. In this role, she coordinates a national program that provides case management services to foreign-born victims of human trafficking. Prior to her current position, Ms. Suero-Stackel worked in various capacities as USCCB MRS's Children's Services Department, coordinating family reunification, child advocate and foster care services for immigrant and refugee children. In 2013, she had the opportunity to work as a child protection consultant in Kenya and Ethiopia. During this 3-month deployment, she interviewed hundreds of children, making recommendations for referrals and placements. Ms. Suero-Stackel is a licensed independent clinical social worker and has 10 years of experience working with immigrant and refugee children and families. Darwency Clark is currently our Associate Director of Processing Operations here at Migration and Refugee Services. He has worked in the refugee resettlement field for over 12 years, originally providing emergency assistance to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program in Accra, Ghana. In 2006, Darwency returned to the U.S. and advocated alongside immigrant and refugee groups striving to reframe comprehensive immigration reform legislation and U.S. refugee protection law. He holds an Artium Magister from the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration with a focus on international social policy. With that, I'll turn it over to Margaret, who will get us started on the basics of Refugee 101.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to just start off with the very basic question of what is a refugee. The most common definition under international law and what's used by the United States is that a refugee is a person who's outside of his or her country of origin and is unable to return due to a well-founded fear of persecution on one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So there are currently about 20 million refugees around the world. There are about 40 million more internally displaced people, so people who might meet that definition but are not outside of their country. Over half of the refugees in the U.S., in the world, are children. So most refugees have survived war or violence. Many will have lost family or friends. All of them have lost their home. Many are families who have fled looking for a safe place to raise their children. Ways that refugees come to the U.S. So each fiscal year, the president consults with Congress and various federal agencies, such as the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, to authorize the admission of a certain number of refugees into the country. So in recent years, that ceiling has been between 50 and 75,000. This year, the ceiling is 85,000, with a possibility of that ceiling being expanded in fiscal year 2017 to 100,000. I don't think that's a formal proposal yet, but I think that's what the Office of Refugee Resettlement is telling states to plan for. So those numbers on their own sound large, but what they mean is that less than 1% of any of the refugees around the world are resettled, so very small numbers are ever actually even considered for resettlement. Many will stay in the country they fled to, either through a formal local integration process or with no formal legal status. Some may eventually be able to repatriate to their country of origin. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to sort of make this more concrete and talk about one refugee family. You can see in the picture Balthazar and Alphonsine, and they're with a coworker at the Catholic Charities in Lansing. So they fled from Burundi. They were being subject to both violence and ethnic tension in their homeland, and spent more than 10 years moving around in different neighboring countries, which is not uncommon for refugees to flee their home country and not find safety or security even in a neighboring nation. Eventually, they were resettled in Michigan through the U.S. Resettlement Program. So I'll read you their description, brief description of their experience. In Tanzania, we were among the first to come to a refugee camp, which grew to over 40,000 people. Every family, regardless of their size, had a small tent for shelter and were given a 6-meter plot in front of the tent to grow food. Being in a refugee camp provides some safety, but it is also like a prison. There is no leaving to go to the city, and it is difficult to improve your life in any way. We stayed in the refugee camp for 3 years. By this time, we had a baby girl, and our son was going to school under a tree in the camp. So they were resettled, as I said, to Michigan and integrated into their community. They're now working with the Catholic Charities in Lansing, helping other refugees who have been resettled there. So I'm going to go through the resettlement process to kind of explain the steps along the way. The main thing that I want to emphasize is that refugee resettlement is very different from any other way that immigrants enter the United States. Refugees go through the highest level of security screening of any entrant to the U.S. And the process is very complicated. It takes several years usually, at least 2, often more. And it is quite different from what we have heard of in terms of Syrian refugees entering Europe, which is kind of a mass influx of people pouring over borders. Resettlement into the U.S. is an orderly process. All of the security screening and the steps happen overseas before the refugees ever come to the U.S. So this is just a quick flow chart of kind of a visual representation of what Balthazar and Alphonsine would have gone through from identification and registration with UNHCR to arrival in the U.S. I'm going to go through step by step the different stages in the process. So when they first arrived in a UNHCR camp, they would have registered at the camp. UNHCR collects biographical information. In some locations, for instance, with Syrians, there is some biodata that's collected, including iris scans. And UNHCR is determining that anybody in the camp actually meets that definition of a refugee, which I gave at the beginning of the presentation. Then UNHCR will give some consideration to who in the camp might actually be
someone to consider for resettlement into the U.S. So as I said, when only 1% of refugees are ever resettled, most are considered for resettlement. It tends to be those who are most vulnerable, who have the highest level of need. UNHCR conducts interviews, so they'll verify the identification information they got from the initial registration. They'll go back and discuss the refugee's background, and will prepare detailed resettlement submission documents that go to whatever resettlement country is chosen by UNHCR. So when the United States receives a referral from UNHCR, it begins a long, complex security screening process. So the initial steps are taken by a resettlement support center, and this is usually an agency that is contracted by the United States. It's often a non-governmental organization who does another round of interviewing to confirm the biodata and begin collecting information that will initiate security checks. The National Counterterrorism Center, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the State Department, and others all run the refugees' information through their databases. For some refugees who the U.S. government believes needs a higher level of screening because of the group that they're in or their nationality, an SAO, a security advisory opinion, is also conducted by the FBI and their intelligence community partners. Once all of that is done, the Citizenship and Immigration Services, part of Homeland Security, reviews that application and then interviews the refugee in person. So USCIS employees go to refugee camps or to cities in other countries where there are refugees and conduct an in-person interview. They may do multiple interviews if questions arise during the interviewing process or during any of the security screening. If there are any doubts about whether the person is a security risk, they're not going to be admitted or they won't be approved for resettlement. Fingerprints are taken by USCIS and other biodata is checked against terrorist and criminal databases. Ultimately, the refugee then goes through a health screening, and then subsequent to all of this, if the refugee is approved for resettlement, continuous checks are done against those databases while the refugee is waiting for travel. Just before travel, Customs and Border Patrol does an additional screening before entry into the United States. So once all of the security screening has been done, the State Department refers the refugee to one of 9 voluntary agencies, which are sometimes referred to as VOLAGs, in the United States. And the voluntary agency then determines the resettlement location within the U.S. So each voluntary agency has local affiliates that they resettle with. And that determination is made based on a variety of factors. If the refugee has family in a city, that will likely be the city they're resettled to. If there are particular health concerns that can be best addressed in one place over another, that will be taken into consideration. And then finally, before they leave, refugees go through a cultural orientation, which is intended to give them some sense of the community that they're coming to, the social and cultural expectations, a basic expectation of what their reception will be like in the United States. So I'm going to hand off now to Isabella, who's going to talk about refugee children and specifically how these procedures affect children who are with refugee families or are separated from families. Isabella?
Thank you, Margaret. Hi, everyone. This is Isabella Suero-Stackel. And as Margaret said, I will be talking about the process that children go through when they're resettled to the United States. And to begin, I wanted to provide some definitions of a couple of different terms I'll be using throughout my slides. 2 different types of children are usually being resettled here in the United States. One is referred to as separated children, and those are separated from both parents or from the person who was previously taking care of them. But they might be accompanied by another family member, so they could be, for instance, traveling with an uncle or with a cousin. or something along those lines. And another term used for separated children once they arrive in the United States is attached refugee minor, or ARM. And then we will be talking about unaccompanied children, and those are children who have been separated from both parents and are not being cared for by an adult who customarily would be taking care of them like a relative. Another term that we use for those children are unaccompanied refugee minors when they come to the United States, or URMs. So unaccompanied and separated refugee minors go through a very similar process as Margaret just described families and adults do. They go through the same checks, the same kind of vetting process before they come to the United States, but there is additional assessments done to ensure that resettlement is the best option for those children. One of them is the best interest determination, which I'll be talking more about in the next few slides, which is an assessment done prior to resettlement to ensure this is the best option for a child. And then there's also suitability assessments, which is an additional check of the family members that will be taking care of the child once they come to the United States. And so once the children arrive in the United States as well, they'd receive additional checkups and services because of their vulnerabilities as well. So as I mentioned, when the children are still in the refugee camp overseas or possibly in an urban refugee situation and they're identified for resettlement, they have to undergo a best interest determination. This is a very formal process that has been established by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, with a very strict protocol and safeguards designed to determine the child's best interests. And it really affects, it's really important regarding decisions affecting the child's placement, care arrangements, etc. So a series of interviews and investigations result in a report with a recommendation according to what is in the best interest of the child. And it involves the child as well as other individuals involved in the child's life, such as relatives, social workers, and looks at and balances all those factors to make a determination as to what is in the best interest of the child. Is it to stay perhaps living with the current relative they're living with? Is it to move them to another placement? Is the best interest of the child to be resettled in the United States or another country, etc.? The best interest principle is something that many of you are probably familiar with. It is a guiding principle in the internationally recognized Convention of the Rights of the Child, but it also is a principle that really guides a lot of domestic child welfare work here in the United States. In Article 3 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, it states that all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. So this is really kind of what UNHCR goes by. The United States actually has not ratified the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but also